Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts always be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Please be seated, and if you would, please open a Bible to Ecclesiastes 2, although to be fair, I'm not actually going to stray outside the text, so you can cheat and have your bulletin, but put a Bible, stick your bulletin in the Bible. Anyway, it'll look cooler that way. Everybody around you will think, anyway. Last week I tried to set the stage for this book as we were beginning this sermon series, and hopefully I managed to set a pretty bleak picture about us and about our limits, but a bleak picture into which the goodness of God is ultimately going to break in. But alas, that good stuff is quite a bit down the road for us. However, it would seem that Qoheleth, the ESV calls him the preacher, but I'm just sticking with the Hebrew name for reasons I outlined last week. Qoheleth, it would seem, has thrown me a bit of a curveball this week in week 2. Just look at how our reading this week begins. Verse 1, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. And then a couple verses later, verse 3, I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. Now, as Chef on South Park once put it, there is a time and a place for everything, children, and that place is college. So apparently Qoheleth has decided to kick things off with a flashback to his days at Penn State. And the best part in what he says here is that little parenthetical in verse 3. I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom. Yeah, right. I've been there. I know what I'm doing. I'm a professional, and this is for science. Nevertheless, it would seem all that bleak and depressing stuff from last week that I promised has disappeared rather suddenly. The wisest, smartest man in all the world promised us last week, in all his own fallenness and his own brokenness, a deep, dark dive into the very pit of our human existence, promised us that we would find there the vanity of all our attempts at understanding all of it, at the ungraspability of everything out there. And yet it would seem that Ecclesiastes has instead, by chapter 2, turned into Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Vanity of vanity has become party on, dudes. And yet, is that really so unexpected? I mean, of those I knew in college who were truly dedicated to cheering their bodies with wine each weekend, myself included, I will admit, precious few were actually all that happy with life. In fact, it wasn't so much about cheering one's body as numbing one's mind, trying to forget school or work or grades, trying to ignore a bad relationship, or in my case, trying to ignore the fact of no relationship, right? And of course, it's not just college. I spent the better part of a decade in Manhattan, in the white-collar world there, where the bars and the office districts were packed every single weekday night from 5 till 8 p.m., sometimes longer. We had a running joke at one place where I worked, and it was a particularly dysfunctional place, so it'll make sense when you hear the joke. And it went something like this. Well, you got to go out drinking on Wednesday because it's hump day. And you got to go out Thursday because it's practically Friday. And on Friday, it is Friday. And on Saturday, well, it's Saturday. And on Sunday, well, you've got a long week ahead. And Monday, well, you made it through Monday. But never on Tuesdays because you're not an alcoholic. Of course, if that was funny, it was only because it was sad and true. So much of the time, wine or whatever isn't actually about cheering us. It's just a tool to forget what's behind us or ahead of us, or an attempt to make it easier to deal with whatever we're dealing with at that moment, or sometimes whoever we're dealing with at that moment. I mean, there's nothing like that first glass of wine at family holiday get-togethers, right? And so frankly, if you look at the opening to Ecclesiastes 2 like this, well, it actually turns out to be pretty darn bleak. I mean, I got us back there eventually. You're welcome, right? But to be fair, this is not really all that Qoheleth is getting at here. He may start off by talking about getting a little buzz on now and then to get in a more festive mood, but then in verse 4 and following, things take a turn that, well, most of us can't really emulate. It's like in that movie Justice League when the Flash asks Batman what his secret power, superpower is, and Batman simply replies, "I'm rich," right? Qoheleth's a bit like that. Wisest man in all the world, also richest man in all the world. And so what he describes in verses 4 and following is this enormous construction project, building a complete, happy, self-enclosed little paradise for himself. Houses and gardens and parks and pools and servants and gold and lots and lots and lots of stuff. And apparently lots and lots of ladies too, right? Anyway, in fact, this image seems like something right out of an MTV rap music video, doesn't it? MC Qoheleth is in the house, right? Sipping his Mai Tais poolside with his posse. Yeah, see, that'll rap, that'll work, right? Preachers of LA on steroids, as it were. It's definitely extreme, and I want to get to the extremeness of it, and it's not what it seems. But let's start by first approaching it from the perspective of the question with which this whole book began, the question the book poses in that first line of that opening poem, back up in chapter 1, Ecclesiastes 1:3. I lied. We are going to look at Ecclesiastes 1. But it's short, so you can, anyway. This is Ecclesiastes 1:3. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? What's the purpose of your life? Of life in general? And more specifically, what's the purpose of your work? What are you working for? What's the life you are trying to build? What's its goal? And you can see this line of inquiry later on in Qoheleth's first words to us a few lines later in Ecclesiastes 1. This is verse 13. And I, the preacher, Qoheleth, applied myself to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven, right? All that's done on earth. Qoheleth is trying to figure out, why has God put us on earth? Why has God given us this time to work with? If you think about it for a second, the fact that you are, right? The fact you exist, and you really don't have to. The fact that you exist in the first place is kind of the craziest idea in the entire world. And so what are you supposed to do with this? What do you do with it? And the first part of Ecclesiastes 2 offers you one possible course of action. Make yourself as happy as humanly possible. Or as Viv Savage, the drugged-out keyboardist from Spinal Tap put it, have a good time all the time. That's my philosophy, Marty, right? Take the money from your work, or maybe somebody else's money. I mean, maybe you inherited it, and we'll get to that, right? Take that money and just enjoy. I mean, maybe that is the point of life, just being happy as you can possibly make yourself. Now, of course, if you know Jordan Peterson, you might know that he says that being happy is an absolutely absurd goal for your life. Because you can't control that. You can't control being happy. It's not in your hands. So it's an absolutely terrible goal for you. And it's just going to make you disappointed and frustrated and miserable. Kind of like Jordan Peterson, right? Jordan Peterson fans out there. Anyway. But what Qoheleth is saying is, but wait a second. What if I could Bruce Wayne this whole thing, right? What if I could throw enough money at it so that I could control everything, right? And that is the hypothesis that Qoheleth is working through in this flashback, if you will, at the beginning of Ecclesiastes 2, in this kind of experiment that he conducts. Isn't the highest and best use of life, of the time we've been given by God, to enjoy it to the max? And so what if we could minimize or eliminate, to the extent possible, the pain and maximize the pleasure? Wine does that on a small scale that most of us can probably afford. But if you're Batman or you're Qoheleth or Solomon, you can do this in some serious style. You can legit try to have a good time all the time. Well, as it turns out, the philosophy of Qoheleth that he's experimenting with in this reading at this point has a technical name, a Greek name, as most good technical names do. It's called Epicureanism, and it's named after the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived back in 300s, 200s BC, possibly around the time Ecclesiastes was written, although that's frankly kind of hard to know. And what Epicurus argued was that the highest and best good in life was pleasure. And Epicurus wasn't some sex, drugs, and rock and roll British musician from the 1970s out to destroy wholesome American culture. He was asking, at the end of the day, the same questions that Qoheleth is asking and coming to the same kind of answer for very logical reasons. And for very logical reasons that, frankly, most moderns should appreciate. Right? And that's because Epicurus was an empiricist. That is, like we moderns most of the time, he believed that reality was limited to what you could perceive, what you could see around you. Think Han Solo in Star Wars. There's no mystical energy field controlling your destiny, right? Like that. What you see is what you get. And this life is what you got. And you had best enjoy it to the fullest, rather than denying yourself an expectation of some invisible out there future reward. And to be clear, he doesn't mean excess pleasure. He doesn't mean going to the limits and seeing how much pleasure you can get, right? Epicurus is not Bluto from Animal House, right? There's a point where too much of a good thing ain't all that good anymore, and your job is the good. And so on one level, what Qoheleth is describing is very much in line with this philosophy. And whether the author of Ecclesiastes knew of Epicureanism or not, and there's a lot of speculation out there, who knows? But it doesn't really matter. The point is, Qoheleth is trying to create a world that isolates him from all the hurt out there and increases the potential for always being happy. He has created, quite literally, a paradise. In fact, if you look at verse 5 in Ecclesiastes 2, the word that the ESV translates as parks is in Hebrew pardisim. Right? Hebrew's actually borrowing the Persian word from which we get our word paradise, pardisim, paradise. Now, let's pause there for a second. Unless I'm totally off here, most of us are instinctively inclined to be a bit suspicious of Qoheleth's whole project here. For comparison, if you skip ahead to verses 20 to 21 in chapter 2, where Qoheleth imagines another scenario, I think things resonate a bit more easily, shall we say. This is 2021. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity, ungraspable, and a great evil. Now that I get, right? That you might work your butt off to build a nest egg, and somebody else might get to party with it. That I kind of resonate with. It's not fair. And additionally, I even get where the whole chapter lands. Notice in these last verses of the chapter, notice that work, toil, which was pretty much, at least as we understand working and toiling, totally absent in the MTV video that Qoheleth has constructed for himself in verses 1 to 8. Notice how at the end it now returns as a part of life. Look at Ecclesiastes 2:24. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. Find enjoyment in your work. And that feels not just more realistic about life, but kind of right, kind of proper. And I suspect part of this, not all, but part of this resistance to those opening verses is actually a cultural thing. Because somewhat infamously, as a culture, we Americans, we laud work and a work ethic, at least in theory, right? In practice, it gets messy, it gets complicated. In practice, it's probably more about judging the other guy's work ethic than our own, making excuses for our own, right? And it involves the appearance of working hard, that's always key. But in theory, in principle. Remember that song, Money for Nothing by Dire Straits, right? The guitarist Mark Knopfler basically stole the lyrics while listening to this working class guy and appliance mover complain about how rock stars and MTV didn't actually earn their money. Remember the lyrics? That ain't working. That's the way you do it. You make the money on the MTV. No, that ain't working. That's the way you do it. You get your money for nothing and your chicks for free. All right? And the thing about that song, the whole hook of it, is attention, right? Attention. The fact that it is simultaneously envious of the rock star lifestyle and judgmental towards it. It's like the same way that we are both envious and judgmental towards the French, right? Because they only work like 4 months a year or something, right? And they can take sick days for things like ennui, right? These are historical facts, right? Now, similarly, we both envy and judge Latin Americans because they have made naps an official part of their workdays. We can't stand Prince Harry and Meghan because they're rich royals. We also can't stop talking about them. On the other hand, Elon Musk. Oh, right? You can hear the choirs of angels at this point, right? Now, there's a dude who works his butt off. I mean, at one point, he was working 2 8-hour days back to back at 2 separate companies, both of which he owned. And he's probably only years away from figuring out how he can rewrite the laws of physics so he can do that with dozens of companies in a single day, right? That's the American get-her-done spirit. Although technically he's South African, but let that be, right? And it all makes sense. We're a country basically founded by Puritans, right? Uptight Calvinists who hate Christmas, right? Who felt that your salvation, which wasn't your doing, your salvation is not your doing, sure, but nevertheless, your salvation had better be clearly evident in your work ethic. So, get busy. Right? And so, I don't know about you, and maybe I'm just envious and judgmental, but Qoheleth's MTV lifestyle doesn't sit all too well with me. And yet, we need to do 2 things at this stage. First, we have to take his premise, the premise of his experiment, as legit. And 2, we have to pay attention to specifically what fails in this experiment. So let's take those in turn. The premise of Qoheleth's experiment is that Epicurean idea that avoiding pain and pursuing happiness are good things. Now, Puritan cultural predispositions notwithstanding, it's frankly hard to disagree with that too much. It's actually, if you want to get down to brass tacks, it's actually part of the foundational principles of our country. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's an Epicurean motto if there ever was one. And it makes sense. Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote those words, saw himself as an Epicurean. No surprise there. I mean, talk about a dude who could cheer himself with wine. Only the good French stuff, though. Only the good French stuff. The point is, in the history of philosophy and thought, the pursuit of pleasure, as central to the meaning of life, is 1, it's not all that weird, and 2, probably what everybody wants to do anyway. And so the real issue with Qoheleth's experiment is not the principle of it, not the goal of it, bliss, happiness, endless poolside martinis, whatever it is for you. In fact, if you actually think about it, that is figuratively our ultimate hope. In a little bit, we're going to recite the Nicene Creed together, right? And we're going to declare towards the end of that creed, we look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. And our hope in that life and that resurrection in the world to come is a world of perfect happiness, a world of bliss, a world where every tear gets wiped away and the things that have been oh so wrong in this life will be redeemed and restored and remade without blemish. So the principle can't be wrong, and yet there's definitely something not quite right about what's going on with Qoheleth. And he says as much. Look at verse 11. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, ungraspable, and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. This whole effort, this experiment in happiness of his, it's not only failed, it has proven to be beyond his understanding, beyond his grasping. But what does that even mean? He's created a paradise, and yet, nope, not right. It somehow doesn't work. And I mean, to be fair, it would be a really short book if Qoheleth had discovered that the secret to happiness is just throwing tons of money at something, right? A really small book for a very small, viable audience. It would also mean the Kardashians should be a lot happier than they seem to be, but we digress. The fact is that to say that Qoheleth is throwing money at all life's problems isn't actually really to scratch the surface of what's really going on here, the picture that's really being painted here, and the nature of what's actually failed. Because this world of happiness that Qoheleth is trying to construct isn't just impossible from, say, the point of view of Elon Musk's bank account. It's impossible, period. It's impossible scripturally. In other words, the picture of this happy world that Qoheleth has painted is a very precise, scripturally resonant picture. Now, unfortunately, it's a picture that's easier to see if you read and think in Hebrew and can hear the echoes in the wording of the passage. Still, I think we'll be able to sketch the basic contours of what Qoheleth is getting at well enough. So here's the deal. If you go back, don't do it now, but if you go back to Genesis 1 and 2, the account of creation in the Garden of Eden, and the placing of Adam in that garden to work the garden, there are a number of words and phrases that get used a lot, right? A real lot. Verbs like to make, to plant, to water, to sprout. Nouns like garden, well, obviously enough, but also tree and fruit, especially with the word all for some reason. Now keep all those words in mind: work, make, plants, water, sprout, garden, tree, fruit. And now listen again to Ecclesiastes 2, verses 4 to 6. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing, or technically sprouting, trees. In other words, Qoheleth is taking all the words of Genesis 1 and 2, the words of creation, the words of the Garden of Eden story, and he is literally reusing them to remake that story for himself. Now, the desire to return to that primeval, Edenic bliss, is a common delusional utopia. Think Joni Mitchell's 1960s song Woodstock, which at the climactic moment of its course declares we've got to get back to the garden, right? And that's kind of what Qoheleth is humming to himself at this moment. I've got to get myself back to the garden. In other words, that's the fix he's proposing. That's the solution. Let's reboot the whole thing. And so what he's doing here is envisioning himself as a new Adam, as Adam 2.0, creating for himself a fresh reboot in the garden, Garden 2.0, because maybe everything would be okay if we weren't living in such a fallen world, if we could just reverse the clock on the fall. But the problem is that it's not really the conditions of the world in which we live. The problem is us. And Qoheleth enacts that very problem right before our eyes, even as he sees himself setting all things back to right. Because besides all that Genesis 1 and 2 language, the other thing going on in Qoheleth's description of this grand paradise construction project is the repetition of the phrase, for me. It repeats itself 8 times in the Hebrew over the course of only 5 verses. And so whatever paradise Qoheleth is building, it is most certainly a very self-centered, self-serving, self-absorbed paradise. In fact, those words for me get repeated so often that most English translations, like our ESV, drop a few of them and rephrase a few others just to try to make the English a little less boring and wooden. Still, if you skim over those verses again in the ESV, you'll see at least a few. For myself in verses 4 and again in 8. Myself in verse 5 and 6, and even at the end of verse 9, down a verse further, where he's summing everything up, where it sounds in the ESV as if Qoheleth is just trying to tell us that he hasn't gone crazy with this stuff, right? If you look at the second half of verse 9, he says, also my wisdom remained with me. Well, as it turns out, that is the same self-centered phrase in Hebrew once again. And so it's actually translated better as, and my wisdom remained for me. For me. In other words, in all this, even my wisdom has ultimately been self-centered and self-serving. Because in constructing a new Eden for himself isn't just an Epicurean thing. Isn't just about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's about trying to create for himself, for little old innocent Qoheleth, an exemption from the fall itself. An exemption from the consequences for the fall. That is, the consequences of life in the world east of Eden, with all its toils and all of its thorns and all of its thistles, with all of its sweat and tears and hurt. And at one level, this seems to make sense, because if the broken world seems to be the cause of the hurt of all your hurt, well, let's start by getting rid of the thing that seems to be the problem, the fallenness and brokenness of this messed up world. And yet the point of Qoheleth's recounting this experiment, and more to the point of his recounting his failure, is to make clear that even if you could throw enough money at everything to recreate paradise, and you can't, all you would be able to do is create another world with that same doomed problem at the center of it all, you. As somebody once said to me, there is a common denominator to every single problem in your life: you. And the conclusion that Qoheleth is therefore forced to reckon with in this failure, even if he doesn't quite understand it yet, even if he never will, is that our hope for what is truly good for us is found in God's strange providence, not in paradise, let alone in our best attempts at some kind of paradise. Because as it turns out, paradise, for some reason, only brings out the worst in us. The self-centered, self-serving worst in us. Just go ask Qoheleth. Rather, our hope is found instead in the world of toil and hurt and suffering east of Eden that we in Qoheleth unfortunately know only too well. In other words, the world which to our self-centered perspective seems to be the problem is actually in God's good redemptive plan the setting for the solution to the real problem, which is ultimately us. And so what we need is not to figure out how to become Adam all over again, like Qoheleth tries to do, to somehow be lucky enough, to somehow be wise enough or rich enough or strong enough or good enough to create for ourselves a perfect life within this broken world, to somehow claw our way back into some ideal garden, but where we are still subject to all the same faults and failings and trust issues and terrible decision skills of the old Adam. No, the problem is us. The problem is that we are the problem, and we therefore need something that is not us. Someone who is not us. An Adam 2.0 who is truly 100% new. One who isn't interested in recreating a paradise for himself, but one who would actually choose to leave his paradise, his lordship, his perfection, his heaven for us. One who would choose actually to enter into our crazy world east of Eden, enter our fallenness in our world for us, and to walk our road of suffering in this world with us. And of course, the good news is, and it's going to be a common refrain throughout this series, the good news is that Jesus here is the greater, perfected Qoheleth, one who doesn't try to be wise, but who is wisdom, one who doesn't use riches, but gives them all up for us, one who shows us in and through the cross that the way home, the way to true heavenly happiness, a happiness that an Epicurean wouldn't have and couldn't have even imagined, is not a beeline for some kind of paradise, but precisely living and being in this place and learning in this place that God has put us and in which God has joined us. And if it is truly hevel, vanity, totally ungraspable, that God has made the path back to him, a path not through paradise, but somehow through this world of hurt and suffering that we cannot stand so much of the time, how much more ungraspable is it, and yet tearfully, beautifully so, that God has taken the same path with us and for us. That the God who carried his cross up that hill of Calvary never leaves us alone as we carry ours in this world. And so like Qoheleth by the end of this chapter, it is not to some once upon a time paradise that we look, but rather we look to the strange and profound hope found in the cross of Jesus Christ, which towers over all the suffering of this world east of Eden and gathers all of it and all of its tears into itself and into the God who was and is and forever will be with us through it all right to the end. And so to him and him alone be all the glory forever and ever. Amen.